Hi everyone, how's it going? You guys coping alright? Personally, I'm on the brink of insanity, so I'm coping with it by talking to my camera. About books. Today I want to talk to you about Stephen King's The Stand, widely considered one of his best books and currently a very topical one because it is about a plague that wipes out 99 point something percent of the human race. You know what's happening. So you might have noticed that this book has a massive page count. This thing is a fucking brick. It's like 1100 pages or some crazy number like that. And you could be forgiven for wondering why a plague story requires that number of pages. It seems like something that would be bloated, right? And Stephen King is kind of known for having a little bit of a meandering storytelling approach. He's known for that, and he's also known for screwing up the ending. More on that later. But I do actually think this book justifies its page count, and it's because of the approach that it takes to telling this story. So the book is split into a few distinct sections. The first of those is basically depicting the downfall of society. It's pretty much what you get, right? You expect to read a plague story where the plague devastates human society, and that's really what the first chunk of the book is about. It tends to be most people's favorites from what I have seen online, and I think this section of the book works for two main reasons. The first of which might actually be a con for some people. It's because of the characters and the time that he spends with them. In general, I think the biggest strength of this book is actually the characters. Stephen King's characters feel so real and so organic. He's just able to imbue them with what I can only describe as like idiosyncrasies that real people all have and fictional characters kind of don't. Fictional characters tend to be easy to box into certain tropes, even if they're really well done. But Stephen King's characters feel like well-rounded, living, breathing people. And part of the reason for that is because of how much time he spends at the start of this book with characters just living their lives. It doesn't start with, well, it kind of starts with a bang, but the plague stuff doesn't really take center stage right away. It's kind of in the background. You know it's coming. You know shit's gonna hit the fan, but it doesn't hit the fan right away, and some people will find that slow. But I really like how much time he spends with the characters at the start of this book. You get to understand who they are and the kind of lives they lead, the little bubbles they live in, the relationships they have with the people in their lives. Basically, you get to understand what normal really means for them. And I think that makes it really hit harder when shit does eventually hit the fan, which you know it's gonna do, because that's what the story's about, right? All of these people are gonna go through some shit and maybe not come out the other side. So, when that happens for all of them, it is a lot more relatable, and that is because of the amount of time he spends in their shoes, just, showing you their day-to-day struggles, their family drama, the shit that's happening that happens when there's not a plague wiping out humanity, The other reason why the first third or so of this book works so well is because of the world building chapters. I can't really think of a better way to put them. But what Stephen King does is he kind of alternates between chapters that are from a specific character's point of view, whoever that might be. There's a pretty big cast of characters in this book, which you might imagine because look at this thing. But some of these chapters are not from any of their points of view. It's kind of from a world level point of view. It's like an omniscient point of view where you just get direct information about what's happening in the world at large. How is everything being affected, not just these specific people. And I think this two-pronged approach really helps to sell just how devastating this is to the entirety of society. You have the emotional stakes which you build through the time that you spend with the main characters before everything goes down. And when you spend all that time with them, you are invested in them as individuals, which makes their parts of the story powerful. And then you contrast that with these other chapters that show you what's happening in the world at large, and that conveys the scale of what's happening, right? It's not personal now, it's all about everything. It's about the world. So for anyone who's here, who's reading this book or thinking about reading this book or has read this book for the plague aspect, seeing a plague devastate society, I struggle to think of a better way you could tell that story. It really does hit every sort of beat that anyone could want, I would think, unless you want like a fast-paced, like adrenaline rush survival story type thing. This is definitely not that. If that's what you're looking for, I don't know, I don't have any recommendations or anything, but you gotta be willing to put up with a slow burn if you read this book. But again, duh. Now for me, the most interesting part of a story like this is not necessarily seeing how things fall apart, but seeing how things are put back together. I want to see how the survivors pick up the pieces. I want to see how human society continues after it has effectively been wiped out. Now obviously in this book it's a little bit different from like, I don't know, a zombie movie or some other takes on that type of story. There's no one actively trying to kill the remaining scratch that. But you get the idea. The world is basically the same, there's just way fewer people in it. There's like a bunch of empty streets and empty everythings, but functionally, if someone was there to push the right buttons, you could conceivably have a modern society again. And it's interesting to see, whether or not that happens, and if it happens, how it happens. That was what I came for, really. And although the actual, first chunk of this book was still very interesting, what I found really compelling was seeing how the survivors moved on after the fact. It's not just the material conditions though. You can imagine that going through something like that would leave some serious psychological scars, right? Like mentally, how do you pick up the pieces? Probably everyone you know is dead, realistically, right? Maybe one person is alive, but more likely everyone is dead. So what does that do to you? And this book does touch on that. It does touch on that in a satisfactory manner, I think. So if that's what you're interested in, I think you will come away satisfied. Maybe not if that's the only thing you're interested in, because it is a brick, but it is something that is acknowledged in the story, and I really enjoyed that. Once again though, seeing the survivors and them moving on with their lives works because of the character writing. It has to be good, otherwise you won't really care if they pick up the pieces or not. You won't really care what they do. I can't really stress enough how great the characters are in this book, and how much they really carry the story. The characters are the draw. You might come to it thinking the plague is the draw, but you're gonna leave it thinking, man, those characters, they were something else. I want to give a shout out to two in particular, those being Harold Lauder and Larry Underwood. Now, I mentioned how Stephen King is able to write really relatable and organic characters, and part of that is because he doesn't shy away from the less glamorous parts of the human condition. Some of these characters are relatable in ways that might make you uncomfortable to acknowledge, and that is definitely the case with these two. I don't like the fact that I can relate to either of these guys, but I can, and I do, and I understand them pretty much right off the bat. Harold in particular, I think, is a phenomenal character. If I was to explain him, I would say he's basically the quintessential incel, as it has been characterized in modern internet lingo. And if you aren't aware of what the word incel means, lucky you. Basically, it stands for involuntary celibate. Think of like neckbeard, like that stereotype, but like turned up to 11. It's crazy that a character that would be so relevant today was written so many decades ago. This book came out in the 70s originally. And yet, if it came out today, you can bet your ass there would be tons of headlines about Harold Lauder, the incel character. I mean, it's not like the people who are now described as incels just popped up out of nowhere in the last 10 years or anything like that. But it is pretty crazy to think about the fact that it was already done so well decades before we ever had a word for it. The other character is Larry. Larry is a bit of a whiny, entitled, narcissistic moron. And while I wouldn't necessarily describe myself using all those words, I think that's something that everybody has in them to a certain extent. We might not like to acknowledge it, and it might not be a dominant part of who we are, but it's there. And the way Stephen King portrays that and basically builds an entire character around those traits is great. It really is. But back to the story. I keep gushing about the characters because they're the best part. But the second act of this book is where some people lose interest because Stephen King introduces some supernatural stuff. And it's not necessarily done that well. Basically, massive book, massive cast of characters, very sprawling cast of characters geographically as well as from a character writing standpoint. They are all in very different places. So how do you tell a cohesive narrative with all of these characters? Well, Stephen King kind of hand waves it away with some supernatural dreams that they start having, telling them like where to go and stuff like that. It's very hand wavy, it's very convenient. It's just like, yeah, God did it, whatever. Which some people just don't like. And I can totally understand that. I can say it didn't necessarily bother me that much because I felt like a plot contrivance was inevitable to bring all of these characters into a cohesive-ish storyline. And, again, with the characters being as great as they are, a plot contrivance almost doesn't matter because you just want to see them go on their personal journey, right? The dreams or whatever else it might have been if it wasn't dreams, doesn't matter. Do whatever you gotta do. The journey that the characters go on and their interactions are all more than worth the hand-wavy supernatural stuff. But that being said, when you get to the third act, it does get a little bit problematic because the supernatural elements of the story start to take center stage, and that is a little bit disappointing. It's not that the characters stop being interesting, because I would say that every single character who has a major role in this story gets a satisfying character arc. No exceptions really that I can think of. But when you're reading about what feels like a very human story and all of a sudden all this supernatural conflict stuff starts to take the foreground and none of it is really explained very well and none of it is in very much depth, it's all very convenient. It's all very hand-wavy. It's not particularly compelling. The story in the third act, I should mention, for the most part revolves around a conflict between two groups of survivors. One of them is full of protagonists, and one of them is full of antagonists. It's very black and white, very good and evil. I didn't mind that, but some people might. That being said, the actual people within these factions are still well characterized. It doesn't feel like it loses nuance. It's really just how supernatural it is that starts to take away from the story. But the antagonistic faction is led by Randall Flagg, who is an absolutely terrifying antagonist. This dude is creepy, he's weird, he's scary, he really tingles my jingles and not in a good way. But he's not the only antagonist. There are some other antagonists as well whose names I will not say because who knows who they might be. If you read the book tomorrow, who could say? Who could say who's an antagonist and who's a protagonist? So yeah, to summarize the story, the first act is excellent. The second act is also very good, but with some hand-wavy stuff that you might not be a fan of. In my opinion, though, I actually think the second act is more interesting than the first because, like I said, I want to see how people pick themselves up after the fact, and that's what the second act gives you, despite the plot contrivances. That aspect of the story, as well as the character journeys and their character interactions, made it my favorite part of the book. The third act is still great from a character writing perspective. I don't think that stuff is ever compromised. It's just that the story is not necessarily told through the most intriguing mechanisms, I guess is the way to put it. But the draw is the characters. The draw is definitely the characters. If you're not really someone who likes slow burn character based novels, I feel like you might not come away from this book or even finish this book. Even if you are interested in the actual premise, which is a plague wiping out all of humanity, very topical right now. But if you do give it a shot, I think a lot of people are going to find themselves entranced with the way that Stephen King characterizes the vast majority of people in this book. It is really, really good. Genuinely fantastic. I do want to point out that Stephen King is known as a horror writer, right? Freaky clowns and stuff like that. This is not strictly a horror novel. It is scary to think about stuff like this happening, obviously, because nobody wants to think about society collapsing and everyone they know dying, or dying yourself, of course, which is far more likely if you're in this one. But it isn't like a scary novel. For me, stuff like demons and shit like that stuff does not sit well with my stomach. I can't even open doors after I watch a horror movie with demons in it. It just freaks me out. But this book didn't really capture those emotions. It was creepy and disturbing, and there definitely is a content warning. If you want to read this book, there's a lot of really disturbing imagery and just fucking creepy shit. I know that's not like deep analysis, but it's just creepy. And if you do struggle with sexual abuse and sexual violence as well, I think you should be warned that there is some of that in this novel as well. For me, the creepiest parts of this book involve the character named the Trash Can Man. There's just something so deeply disturbing about his chapters. And if you read the book, I think you probably agree with that. There's one scene with that guy that's gonna like stick in my head for the rest of my life. I am never gonna forget it. But overall, it's not a horror book necessarily. That being said, considering current events, it might be a little bit higher on the horror rungs than it normally is. So anyways, TLDW, TLDR, TLD something. Great characters, fantastic characters. Characters alone make me want to read more Stephen King. Story has its ups and downs. There's some really strong stuff. The first third of the novel, I think, is universally considered excellent by pretty much everyone. The second act has a few plot contrivances, but nothing major. And the third act kind of falls apart in that sense, but is still very much worth reading in my opinion. Overall, I would say The Stand is a great book. I don't know about doing numerical ratings because I feel like they're a little bit dismissive and reductive, even though I have a Goodreads account and rate everything I read, but I'm not going to do that here. And just like I am not going to do that, you should not like or subscribe or do any of that, because who the hell knows when I'm going to do this again. Like I said, I'm on the brink of insanity. I'm talking to a camera. I'm looking at myself talking to a camera. But if you do feel like it, leave a comment, because I'm very interested in hearing people's takes on this novel. If you've read it recently especially, what was your experience like? Reading the news and then reading this book and then reading the news and then reading this book. I can imagine that being very, very tiring. But don't leave a comment if you don't want to. Do it of your